Welcome back to Boring Historian Sleepy. Tonight you will travel gently through the candlelit corridors of a forgotten monastery, where history sleeps and whispers its forbidden secrets through the ivy-covered stones. And as your body relaxes and your thoughts begin to slow, I want you to imagine the year is 1272 AD, and the winds of early spring sweep across the green hills of the English countryside, where sheep graze beneath thick clouds, and the quiet stone monastery sits in silence beneath the watchful eyes of heaven. Inside that monastery, tucked behind rows of pews and cold iron candle stands, lives an old monk named Brother Thomas, who has spent more than 60 winters inside these cloistered walls. Yet tonight, as the bells toll vespers, he does something he has not done in over 4 decades. He removes a leather-bound book from beneath the chapel floor and begins to write again. Not prayers, but memories. He begins his ink-scratched page with trembling hands, recalling the faces and whispers of villagers who once confessed their deepest sins to him, sins not of murder or theft, but scenes of desire, of flesh, of tangled limbs in the dark corners of barns and behind cathedral altars. He remembers Agnes, the baker's daughter, who came to him weeping at 15, saying she had danced too close to a traveling bard during harvest festival, and how his fingers had grazed her thigh beneath her woolen skirt as he sang songs about saints and temptation. He writes about the superstition that floated through every hut and hamlet that intercourse before marriage would invite the devil to feast on your womb, and yet, behind hedgerows and within haylofts, those same villagers abandon fear in favor of warmth and breath and moans muffled by straw. He remembers how the church declared S3X holy only when performed between man and wife, missionary, and for procreation, but how in confession after confession, the truth whispered differently, like when a young widow named Maud admitted she lay on top of her lover, because she believed that being the rider was the only way her late husband wouldn't haunt her bed. Brother Thomas closes his eyes now, his feather pen paused above the page, and the fire from the chapel hearth flickers as if reacting to the stories about to be unburdened from his soul stories of indulgence. Wrapped in robes of shame and of young monks whose oaths of chastity cracked under the weight of a shared blanket during long cold winters, he continues writing, remembering how villagers believed garlic rubbed on genitals could prevent pregnancy, and how midwives, often persecuted as witches, secretly brewed teas from wild herbs like pennyroyal and mugwort to ease unwanted swelling of the belly. He writes of the noble knight who confessed to lusting after his lord's wife and to laying with her in the stables, while squires stood guard, and how the smell of horses and hay forever stained his memories of love with the scent of guilt. He recalls how peasants believed the devil lived in a woman's hair, and that staring too long into her eyes could steal a man's soul. And yet women adorned themselves with braided ribbons and kohl-lined lashes, tempting even the most pious of husbands. And he writes of the secret texts hidden deep in the monastery's library, manuscripts in Latin that described not only the anatomy of sin, but its practice, detailing the positions that were permitted, the ones punished by penance, and the ones the monks copied twice for reasons they never admitted aloud. As you listen now, sinking further into your bed, feel yourself floating through the flickering candlelight of this medieval world, where passion was wrapped in wool, morality clashed with hunger, and the human body, so tightly controlled, still found ways to ache, to reach, to satisfy. He remembers to the night he walked in on 2 novices kissing beneath the bell tower, stairs both boys no older than 17, and how he turned away silently, not out of acceptance, but because the sadness in their eyes matched his own long-buried longing. He writes of how married couples, often strangers at the altar, learned to become lovers in the dark, fumbling through duties taught to them by no one, mimicking livestock or simply obeying whispers passed down from grandmothers who had once known pleasure in silence. He pens the tale of Lady Eleanor, whose husband, a baron with gout and graying teeth, visited her only to plant heirs, while she found true release with a blacksmith's apprentice who wiped her tears with soot-stained hands and kissed her wrists in the shadows of the forge. He recalls how during Lent, S3X was forbidden for 40 nights, but how many ignored it, finding justification in dreams or in scripture lines twisted like ivy around their desires. And he writes of his own temptation, of Sister Beatrice, the nun with hair like spilled wine, whose glance across the refectory once burned hotter than the candles on the altar, and whose absence from morning prayers became the silence he never dared to question. With every line, Brother Thomas exhales, as if each memory lifted a stone from his chest, and the ink on his parchment becomes the confession of not only others, but of himself, a man trapped between heaven's call and earth's pull, between God's silence and the body's cry. Outside, the moon rises over the monastery, and the wind rustles through the trees like the whispered names of long-lost lovers. And inside, Brother Thomas closes his book and returns it beneath the floorboards, where it will sleep again until you, dear listener, are ready for the next chapter. Let your eyes grow heavier now, knowing that these stories are safe in the stillness of time, and that tomorrow when you return we will open that book again and explore what it meant to desire in the shadows of stained glass, to touch in a world ruled by fear, and to love in the middle of the Middle Ages. And so, as the moonlight slithered through the wooden shutters of the scholars, humble study spilling onto cracked scrolls and glistening oil lamps that flickered with the whisper of knowledge, your breath begins to settle into a slow, rhythmical pattern, each inhale dragging you deeper into the warm, echoing chambers of time, where the cries of agony and the balm of care intertwined like ivy on marble. And just as your eyes drift to Hartfleet, you find yourself once again in the heart of ancient Rome, not as a passive dreamer, but as a wandering soul tethered to a healer's hands, a watcher of the wounded, a listener to the murmur of fevers and the brittle crack of bones, long before antiseptics and anesthesia were even whispered in the wind. You walk now through a bustling alley near the Tiber, your feet tracing the worn cobbles still damp from the morning drizzle, and around you, the scent of iron mingles with that of roasted garlic and crushed herbs, and you see a crowd gathered near a makeshift wooden table, where a man in a blood-streaked tunic holds up a curved bronze scalpel, the kind shaped not for beauty but for burrowing, for removing death where it rooted itself inside the flesh of slaves, soldiers, or the unlucky poor. And this man, this medicus, has no diploma but 100 memories etched into the backs of his calloused hands, each scar a name, each stain a sigh. You inch closer unnoticed as the medicus prepares to lance a swollen abscess on a boy's shoulder, the kind that might today be numbed or drained in sterile light. But here it is greeted with only the strength of two strong men holding the child down and the urgency of survival, and though he screams as the blade breaks skin, there's a hush that follows when the pus bursts forth like a foul river, because here, pain is not a tragedy, it is a doorway to survival, and those who pass through it earn their place among the breathing once more. Later, in the quiet dark of a tiny taberna near the Suburna, you meet a woman known to locals as Livia, the soother, who once served in a domus of nobility, but left the silk-draped trappings behind to learn the roots and waters of healing from a Gallic midwife. And now she moves like a shadow through Rome's narrow alleys, her satchel filled with pungent salves of frankincense and rue. And as she enters a home where a fever has gripped a mother of 4, you watch her light a clay censer and whisper to the gods of health, not as a priestess, but as a woman who has seen too many eyes glaze over under the weight of unseen illness. She lifts the mother's head, checks her tongue, feels her pulse, with 2 fingers that seem to see more than most men's eyes, and then she mixes a bitter draught from dried willow bark and honey and coaxes it past the cracked lips of the patient, murmuring encouragement in a soft Latin only known to women who hold life in one hand and death in the other. And when she's done, she leans back and waits, not because she expects miracles, but because she knows time and touch and tincture must all work together to pull a soul back from the brink. Further down the line of your dreaming path, you find yourself near the temple of Aesculapius on the Tiber Island, where sick pilgrims have tied their hopes to marble columns with offerings of terracotta limbs and waxen hearts. Each token a silent scream, a whispered prayer, a desperate bargain with the god of healing. And inside the sanctum, a priest gently leads a blind man to rest among others who suffer with twisted spines, failing lungs or festering sores. And at night the healing begins, not with medicine, but with dreams. For in these sacred chambers, it is believed that the god himself whispers cures into the minds of the sleeping, and so they lay there, wrapped in linen and hope, waiting for revelation to come in the shiver of a vision or the trembling of a dream-born voice. And in your timeless presence, you drift from body to body, pain to pain, watching how the Romans embraced a spectrum of healing, from the visceral to the divine, from the mercenary surgeons in the camps of the legions where soldiers were patched up with speed and efficiency, bones sawed and cauterized in the field, to the holistic whispers of old women in countryside villas, who knew how to bind wounds with cobwebs and soothe coughing fits with syrup made from figs and pine sap. And even the most skeptical of minds in the Senate could not deny the strange power of certain charms. Amulets inscribed with Greek symbols or Egyptian words tucked beneath togas or tied around wrists like silent protectors against the invisible plague. You pass through the barracks of a Roman military outpost in the shadow of Britannia's misty frontier, where a medicus stationed there uses crude forceps and heated instruments to remove an arrowhead from a centurion's thigh, the smell of burning flesh biting into the cold morning air. And all the while, the soldier bites down on a strip of leather and doesn't flinch, not because the pain isn't unbearable, but because in Rome pain is a price paid by men of duty, a badge worn beneath their armor, unspoken but shared in glances over campfires where they drink thick wine and wait for the ache to dull into memory. And somewhere in a noble estate near Capua, you watch as a wealthy family brings in a Greek physician, educated in Alexandria, fluent in the philosophies of Galen and Hippocrates, who dissects not bodies but words, reading the patient's humors like omens in smoke, prescribing not just herbs but lifestyle changes, dietary regimens, and regulated emotions, for he believes that balance is not just in the gut or the blood but in the mind, the spirit, the very temperature of one's breath as it leaves the lungs. In a quiet moment he takes you aside, though you are but a drifting soul, and shares a chilling truth whispered by many of his kind, that even the most elegant prescriptions and revered texts cannot always explain why some recover and others wither, why a child with a cough one morning is dead the next night, or why a dying man suddenly rises after seeing a dream of his mother long past, calling him back toward life with open arms. And as he walks away you feel it's this thread of wonder of the inexplicable which pulses through every cut, every bruise, every fever dream you've witnessed on this journey, and you realize the Romans, despite their iron and order and empire, bowed before it too. The raw, messy chaos of the human body and the fragile spark that clings to it through leechings, poultices, and whispered prayers. And so, as your breath slows and your body drifts into a deeper stillness, remember that this world you travel is not gone, for in every gauze-wrapped wound, every hand that trembles over a heartbeat, every sigh of relief at the cooling of a fever, Rome lives again, echoing not in marble arches but in the eternal art of healing. And when next you open your eyes, you may still taste the bitter bite of willow bark or hear the soft hymn of Aesculapius in the night wind. And so, as Gaius dipped the ink-drenched stylus into the first of his blank scrolls, the warm evening sun casting gold upon the cluttered shelves of his modest shop, he began with a tale whispered to him by an old Gallic woman who once served in the house of an aristocrat, a woman who had seen the private affairs of Rome from beneath the veils of both service and secrecy, a woman who swore that in the opulent villa of her dominus, the walls were lined not only with marble and mosaic, but with the soundless echoes of pleasure rituals that unfolded beneath the moonlight in the peristyle courtyard, where slaves, freedmen, and nobles alike would meet not as masters and servants, but as veiled actors in a nightly theater of sensual play. These stories, Gaius wrote, were not mere gossip but vital reflections of the city's peculiar heartbeat, where pleasure was not hidden in shadow but often paraded with ceremony, as was the case during the Floralia festival, a springtime celebration originally in honor of Flora, the goddess of flowers and fertility, but which, over the centuries, became a raucous affair where prostitutes were permitted to perform nude dances on public stages while respectable citizens, masked and adorned in floral garlands, joined in Bodhi songs and drunken embraces beneath fluttering petals of dyed silk raining from rooftops. Gaius then told of the strange codes by which Romans lived their double lives, such as the subtle practice of wearing different tunics or rings to signify interest in certain kinds of companionship, and how in the quieter forums or along the edges of the Circus Maximus, lovers could be found writing poetic graffiti, sometimes explicit, sometimes heartbreakingly tender onto stone walls with charcoal, like the now faded message in Reggio 7 that read, "Lucilla, your kisses still burn on my lips, though the gods took you last summer." His stylus moved quickly now as he recalled the tale of Cassius, a wealthy merchant who disguised himself as a common baker each Lupercalia, the infamous mid-February festival of fertility, where men would strip naked save for goatskin loincloths and run through the streets flogging young women with thongs made of sacrificed goat hide, a practice believed to bless the wombs of barren wives. And Cassius, despite his wealth, longed only for the exhilaration of anonymity and the slap of cool air on his skin as he dashed through the throng laughing, wild and free. One scroll was nearly filled, yet Gaius pressed on, driven by a flicker in his chest that felt like duty or destiny. And with a breath drawn through the incense-thick air of his shop, he began another story. This time about a man named Terentius, a Roman soldier who fell deeply in love with a Greek slave during the Dalmatian campaigns. And though it was forbidden by both military code and social expectation, Terentius risked his rank to buy the man's freedom and took him home to Rome, where they lived quietly as roommates, sharing a modest domos near the Subura, hiding their affection from neighbors, but recording their love in hidden etchings carved beneath the cistern lid behind their courtyard, now worn by water and time. Gaius could not help but marvel at the contradictions of Rome, a place where nudity in baths was commonplace, where satirical plays mocked senators with scenes of sexual absurdity, where even emperors such as Caligula and Nero hosted scandalous feasts in floating barges that drifted across artificial lakes, adorned with silken sails and perfumed slaves who poured wine directly into the mouths of reclining guests. Yet the same city punished adulterous women with exile and treated female desire as something suspicious, even dangerous. He paused, setting down his stylus to massage his cramped hand, his eyes drifting to the small clay figurine of Venus that stood between two scroll cases, and he whispered aloud the next memory, a tale told to him by an Alexandrian trader, who spoke of the House of the Faun in Pompeii, where erotic frescoes adorned even the servant quarters, and where a secret garden room contained a small altar with carvings depicting Priapus balancing his enormous phallus on a scale, a symbol not merely of fertility but of prosperity and balance between passion and prudence. As the night deepened and lamps flickered low, Gaius recorded one last tale before rest, the story of Julia Barbilla, a noblewoman and poet who traveled with Emperor Hadrian to Egypt and inscribed verses on the Colossi of Memnon, poems that hinted not only at myth and empire but at longing, passion, and the deep ache of separation from a lover she could not name in marble but could never forget in ink. And with that final line, Gaius leaned back, the soft sound of Rome sleeping beyond his window, and he realized that in gathering these stories, in preserving the erotic, emotional, and often forbidden whispers of a city obsessed with appearances yet ruled by hidden passions, he had given voice to those who history often reduced to silence. And so, as the flames of the oil lamps gently flickered against the marbled walls of the tiny shop nestled along the Via Sacra, Gaius leaned once more into his writing table, the scrolls beside him gently unrolling as if the stories within had been waiting patiently for centuries to breathe again. And with a soft sigh, he dipped his stylus into the ink and continued chronicling the memories that refused to be buried with time, this time focusing on the tales whispered behind curtains and walls, behind togas and tunics, behind statues and temples, tales of forbidden desires, indulgent passions, and the unsaid customs of Roman bedrooms, where what happened in private chambers often echoed through generations in silent legacies and trembling breaths. There was one such tale passed to him by an old courtesan who had long since retired to the coastal town of Herculaneum, where the wind was kinder to aging bones, and the sound of waves seemed to wash away the memories of moans that once filled luxurious Roman villas. And she told him, perhaps out of guilt, or simply because no one else had asked, that during the reign of Emperor Caligula, there existed a secret theater within the Palatine Hill, built not for plays or political debates, but for performance of a different kind, where selected nobles and hand-picked slaves would be invited to partake in what the court called spectacular carnies, spectacles of the flesh, where aristocrats would observe or participate in orchestrated scenes meant to blur the lines between art, lust, and power, and where everything from whispered kisses to orchestrated orgies was played out under flickering torchlight, and not a soul who walked out remained untouched by what they saw or did. She had attended not as participant but as a musician, a flutist, hidden behind a silk veil, and from her corner she had seen everything, from the senator who trembled beneath the touch of a boy he had once owned, to the noblewoman who demanded her body be covered in honey, so a line of handmaidens could lick her clean, and, as she told Gaius, she did not know whether the scenes she watched were art or madness, only that the look in the emperor's eyes as he watched from the shadows was not that of pleasure, but of control, and it frightened her more than any act performed on the marble floors before her. Gaius paused, the edge of his stylus shaking slightly, not from fear but from the sheer weight of the memory he had just transcribed, and he could almost hear her voice still echoing in the corners of his room, as if her confession had lingered like incense smoke, haunting and sweet. There were other tales too, softer ones not drenched in politics or cruelty, but in longing and loneliness, such as the story of Marcus, a baker's apprentice from Trastevere who had fallen in love with a gladiator named Drusus, and every morning before the sun rose, Marcus would leave a fresh loaf of honeyed bread outside the gladiator's barracks with a single violet tucked in starflower the Romans associated with secret affection, and, though Drusus could never respond in words for fear of punishment, he would always find a way to return the message, leaving behind olive oil or a strip of cloth scented with his sweat and blood, and for months their love existed in silence and tokens, until the day Drusus was killed in the arena and Marcus, upon hearing the news, never baked again. Gaius had heard that story from an old market woman who sold flowers near the Colosseum, and though her hands trembled and her back was bent, her eyes gleamed with the clarity of someone who had loved and lost and remembered every detail like it had happened just yesterday. And she told him that Marcus in his grief would often sit at the edge of the Tiber and hum a song only he and Drusus knew. A lullaby he once sang into the gladiator's bruised ear, as they lay together in the shadows of a storeroom the night before a great fight. The city was filled with such whispers. Gaius knew secrets etched into the stones, into the bathhouses and the brothels, into the fabric of everyday life that pulsed beneath the surface of Roman order, and perhaps no place held more of these hidden stories than the Subura, the infamous district where life and lust intertwined like ivy on cracked walls. He once met a woman there, Lucretia, a former dominatrix who had worked in the Lupanasta legal brothels marked by carved phalluses on their walls, and she told him, with no shame and a smirk that curled like a vine, that many of her clients were men who held great power by day, but begged to be powerless by night. And she remembered how a powerful general would travel miles from his villa outside the city just to kneel on cold stone and be told he was worthless, and how he would pay extra for her to call him my little slave as she pressed her sandal against his mouth. She said there was liberation in those moments, not for her but for them, because Rome demanded strength, masculinity, control, and in her arms they could unshackle themselves from their armor and just exist fragile and flawed, and in that surrender there was a kind of love, strange as it may sound. Gaius wrote that story carefully, letting each word drip like candle wax onto the page, understanding now more than ever that Roman sexuality was not just about pleasure, but about power, identity, rebellion, and sometimes even healing, and that the ways people loved, or pretended to, told far more about the empire than any Senate decree or marble statue ever could. He turned to another scroll, one gifted to him by a scholar who had once served as a tutor to a high-born girl in the house of the Corneli, and the scholar had written about how the young noblewoman, barely of age, had asked once in hushed tones if it was true that Greek women wrote poetry to their female lovers, and when the tutor confirmed it, she had begun writing her own verses, soft longing poems to her handmaiden Tircia, who brushed her hair at night and whispered old Etruscan songs to her when the thunder frightened her. Those poems, Gaius learned, had never been discovered by her family, but they were passed down quietly, copied by handmaidens and slaves, who kept the secret safe, and in time they became a kind of sacred whisper among women of the household, even long after the girl had married a senator and borne him children. Gaius now understood that even in Rome, where the law favored men and the gods themselves seemed sculpted in male forms, love found its way into hidden corners, blooming in letters, tucked beneath pillows, in stolen glances across atriums, in shared baths and borrowed tunics, and perhaps, just perhaps, in those moments the empire was not ruled by emperors, but by those who dared to feel without permission. The stylus scratched softly as he wrote now about a senator named Gnaeus who, despite his marriage and position, kept a lover named Aulus, a sculptor from Capua, and though their relationship was never spoken of publicly, it was an open secret that Gnaeus commissioned statues not for the city but for Alusinute sensual sculptures hidden in his countryside villa, each one capturing the artist's form in impossible detail, from the bend of his spine to the tension in his fingers. And when Alus died of a sudden fever, Gnaeus reportedly wept in the Senate, though he claimed it was from a headache. It was said Gnaeus never returned to that villa, and that the statues remained untouched, covered in white linen, like ghosts waiting for their names to be spoken again. And still Gaius wrote the candle beside him, burning low, the ink drying fast, but the stories rushing from his mind like water from a broken aqueduct. And now he turned to the tale of twin sisters, Sylvia and Julia, who ran a small bathhouse near the Aventine Hill and who were known for offering more than just warm water and soothing oils. Patrons whispered of their synchronized dances, their massages that bordered on magic, their ability to read a person's needs without a word. And yet what fascinated Gaius most was not their allure, but their discipline, for they had a strict rule. Only those who respected their boundaries were allowed back, and any noble or merchant who disrespected them found themselves banned, no matter how much coin they offered. And this unshakable code of honor turned them into legends, not of debauchery, but of sex. And women came from far and wide to learn from them, not how to seduce, but how to wield power without violence. As the dawn began to kiss the edge of the rooftops outside, Gaius set down his stylus, not from exhaustion, but from reverence, knowing that what he had captured was not just tales of lust, but of people, real and raw, layered and complicated. And he wondered how many of their names would vanish in time, how many stories would fade without parchment to preserve them. But not these, he promised. He would write until the last candle burned, until the ink turned dry, until the walls of his tiny shop collapsed into the dust of centuries, because someone had to remember. Someone had to tell the world that even in a civilization built on conquest and marble, it was the quiet moments of love, loss, and longing that truly shaped Rome. In the soft light of dawn, as the sun's golden fingers crept across the rooftops of the eternal city and gently kissed the tiled floors of Gaius' workshop, he stretched his arms above his head and listened to the morning song of the doves perched upon the colonnades of the Temple of Concord, their coos harmonizing with the rustling sounds of Rome awakening. And he moved toward the back wall where the scrolls were neatly arranged, whispering to himself that today he would recount a tale that had long haunted the corners of his mind. A tale whispered through the ages with such care that only the bold dared put it to parchment. And as he unraveled the aged scroll, his eyes scanned the ancient ink strokes, breathing life once again into the story of a Roman noblewoman named Flavia, whose passions defied social norms and whose life painted a portrait of desire, power, rebellion, and the price of freedom in a world chained by tradition. Born in the noble household of the cloudy Flavia, was raised amidst luxury and lineage, taught to be silent, poised, and obedient. Yet even as a child, the glint in her eye defied submission, and as she matured into a woman of radiant beauty and intelligence, whispers followed her down the marble corridors of her family's villa, not just for her wit or her charm, but for the way she stared down senators and scholars alike, demanding to be seen not just as a decoration on her father's arm, but as a sovereign soul aching to taste life beyond the gilded cage. Her first true rebellion came not with a scream but with a letter carefully folded and perfumed with crushed roses slipped beneath the tunic of a Greek slave named Diodorus, a man whose bronze skin glistened in the sun as he toiled in the vineyards. A man forbidden to her not because of law but because of lineage, for noble women were meant to marry senators and generals, not lovers, whose names would never be etched in the marble of family tombs. Their secret meetings took place beneath the shadow of night, beneath the statue of Venus, Closina by the sacred way, where whispers turned to kisses and kisses into moans, muffled by silken hands, and there Flavia learned not just the sweetness of touch, but the courage of vulnerability, for Diodorus did not worship her title or status, but the fire behind her eyes and the tremble in her breath when she spoke of dreams denied. Word of their affair traveled like perfume on warm air, and one night her father, Marcus Claudius, summoned her without speaking a word, merely pointing to the ivory chair across from him and waiting for her to sit, the silence stretching between them like a drawn bowstring, until he finally spoke of honor and shame, of duty and disgrace, and offered her a marriage to a widowed senator thrice her age in exchange for forgiveness and silence about her indiscretions. Flavia refused, not with fury, but with grace, rising from her seat and declaring that she would not be traded like a cask of wine for alliances or land, that her body and her soul belonged to her and no one else. And though her words echoed with clarity, the consequences thundered louder, for within days Diodorus was found dead in the Tiber and Flavia was cloistered in a villa outside. Tiber guarded by servants loyal to her father, and walls thick with scented melancholy. Yet even in exile she found rebellion in the smallest acts, reading forbidden poetry, writing scrolls under a pseudonym that spoke of love without shame, and one day, when a traveling physician visited the villa, with news of Rome, she bribed him with a golden ring and a promise of safety to smuggle her writings into the city, where they were copied, sold, and read aloud in marketplaces, their author unknown but their message unmistakable. That passion was not sin, that women were not property, and that love, in all its forms, was a right, not a crime. Years passed, and Flavia's legend grew even as her name remained a secret to most, until one day, a senator's daughter, inspired by the mysterious scrolls, refused her own arranged marriage, citing the words of the unknown poetess, and that single act sparked murmurs in Rome's salons and temples, a ripple that swelled into waves of quiet defiance, and though Flavia never returned to the forum, her voice echoed within its arches, defying time, stone, and silence. Gaius, finishing the tale, placed the scroll beside the others, his fingers lingering on the edge as if holding the final breath of Flavia's spirit, and then, with the ink still wet on a new parchment, he wrote a single line beneath her name. She did not change Rome, but she cracked the walls just enough to let the light in, and outside, the streets murmured with life, the past dancing silently among the present, whispering to those willing to listen. In the dim stillness of early dawn, as Gaius sat alone in his quiet shop with the glow of the oil lamp flickering against the curling corners of ancient parchment, he gently dipped his reed pen into the ink and began to write once more. Not as a merchant now, but as a humble historian of the heart, the senses, and the lives that had passed like shadows across the narrow Via Sacra stories, which no statue or temple inscription had bothered to preserve. He wrote first of a young Greek slave girl named Myrto who had been brought to Rome in chains, but had found freedom in unexpected ways within the domus of an aging widow who treated her not as property but as a companion, and how, despite the stark imbalance of power that defined most slave-master relations, this one had evolved into a strange and tender alliance of mutual care, whispered confessions at night, and long baths in the private balneum where touches turned from service to softness. Then, with careful strokes and furrowed brow, he recalled the tale of the elderly former centurion, Marcus Crassus, whose war-wounded leg left him hobbling through the forum, but whose evenings were filled with the songs and massages of two twin Syrian brothers, purchased as entertainers but known in the Suburra as the night poets, and how Marcus, weary of Roman cruelty, wept openly when they sang him lullabies in Aramaic that reminded him of distant lands and forgotten comrades. As the sunlight slowly broke through the morning fog, Gaius continued writing of a peculiar ritual once conducted annually in a lesser-known shrine of Venus Verticordia, where women who had borne children outside of wedlock came dressed in white veils to offer tiny carved figurines of male and female genitals at the altar, not in shame but in a plea for divine recognition, seeking spiritual legitimacy for their bodies and choices in a world that saw them as errant or damaged. He documented the life of Fabiola, a freedwoman and healer who lived in the Esquiline district and who, despite her lowly origins, became known for crafting herbal oils, used by the city's wealthiest matrons to heighten their pleasure or soften their flesh before lovemaking, and whose clientele often confessed far more in her little apothecary than they did in their own homes. Leaving behind secrets like loose threads she wove into every bottle she sold. As his pen scratched forward into the parchment, Gaius told the story of a young baker named Linus who had secretly fallen in love with the husband of a senator, and though he knew such feelings were punishable if discovered, he left hidden poems in bread. Loaves sold to the man's steward each morning, hoping the subtle fragrance of longing would rise along with the dough and somehow reach the one he could never touch. Mid-morning sounds began to swell beyond the shop's walls. Vendors shouting, sandals scuffing across the cobblestones, horses clattering past stands. Still Gaius wrote, remembering the temple prostitutes of the Aventine who operated not in the shadows, but under the open sky of the goddess. Bonadia's courtyard, where offerings of honey and figs were shared before each ritual, and where the act of physical union was not deemed profane but divine, a service not of commerce but of spiritual communion. He chronicled the life of Alea, a courtesan famed not only for her beauty, but for her astonishing knowledge of astronomy, who insisted her patrons learn the names of constellations before they were allowed into her bed, and who would lie on rooftops with them under the stars, tracing Venus and Mars with her fingers before pressing lips to ears and whispering myths that turned desire into something celestial. Then there was Calvus, a eunuch servant in the imperial palace whose lack of physical manhood did not prevent him from experiencing deep abiding affection for one of the empress's handmaidens, and whose letters, discovered centuries later buried behind a crumbling mosaic wall, revealed a quiet storm of yearning that defied Roman expectations of what love, identity, and fulfillment could look like beyond the strict binaries of gender and class. He wrote of how, in the countryside, young shepherds often carved phallic symbols into olive trees, not merely as fertility charms, but as declarations of adolescent bravado, and how girls of the village would touch those carvings during spring festivals, giggling beneath garlands and daring each other to name aloud the boy they hoped would notice them during the coming harvest dances. By noon, with his hand cramping and ink running low, Gaius still pressed on, recalling the rarely spoken truth that even emperors were not immune to the complexities of the flesh, for he had once overheard, during his time at the baths, a drunken senator murmuring that Nero wept after nights of passion with his boy, bride Sporus, haunted not by sin, but by the echo of something lost, something human, in his lust for control and spectacle. He described, with solemnity, the rituals of mourning lovers, how widows would sleep wrapped in the togas of their dead husbands for months, how some young men would carve initials into their own skin in remembrance of a lost partner, and how in the catacombs, beneath the city, faded graffiti showed hearts pierced by arrows with names entwined like vines, anonymous lovers, leaving a final trace in stone where society would never find it. And as the afternoon drifted toward golden stillness, Gaius turned his memory to his own past, to the quiet summer when he had loved a painter named Drusus who once lived above the fishmonger near the Tiber, a man with sun-stained fingers and a laugh that startled pigeons from the rooftops, a man who kissed him once on a night filled with music, and then vanished during the purge of Domitian's suspected dissenters, leaving behind only a small fresco hidden behind the counter that no one else ever noticed. With a heavy heart, but steady hand, Gaius ended the day's writing with a final tale, one of a Vestal virgin named Livia, who, rather than breaking her vow through secret liaisons, found comfort in the tactile rituals of grooming the temple doves, in stroking their feathers and murmuring names she dared not speak aloud, channeling her love into care, into softness, into an invisible current of touch that never violated any law, yet left her breathless all the same. As dusk painted the sky with streaks of orange and lavender, Gaius leaned back, setting down his pen and reading over the day's ink-stained parchment, not as a scholar, but as a witness, a memory keeper of those whose desires had been lived, hidden, punished, celebrated, and forgotten. Now gently revived by the scratching of his pen and the silence of his heart, he rolled up the scroll, tied it with faded thread, and placed it on the growing pile near the shop's rear wall, where shadows of ancient Rome's intimate history now slumbered together like lovers beneath a shared blanket, waiting for someone, someday, to find them and understand that in every breath, every touch, and every whispered name, the true history of a people was always more than just marble and war. Gaius, sitting alone under the flickering light of an oil lamp as night wraps itself tightly around the rooftops of the eternal city, lets his fingers drift over the soft parchment before him, while the tip of his stylus dips gently into the inkwell beside a slowly cooling bowl of lentil soup. Untouched for hours, his mind still lingering on the tale the baker's wife had shared about her years as a domina in a noble household where forbidden love bloomed behind curtains embroidered with golden vines. He writes of Demetia, a name almost lost to time, who once stood upon the polished marble floors of a senator's villa as both a wife and a witness, her beauty traded in dowries and her nights filled with whispered promises from both men and women who saw her not as property but as poetry. As she traced her fingers along the cool stone walls and let herself feel alive not through duty but through rebellion. Through Gaius's words we return to Domicia's youth, when she was brought from the provinces at the age of 14, her skin still kissed by the sun of the countryside, and how she was taught the ways of Roman civility, how to bow without lowering her gaze too much, how to recline at the triclinium with practiced grace, how to speak without threatening a man's pride. But what no tutor taught her was how to survive the glances that lingered too long, or the way power dripped like honey from every touch. In her chambers, Domitia kept a small bronze mirror shaped like the moon, a gift from an older woman who had once served in Cleopatra's court, and it was to that mirror that she confessed her secrets at night, how she dreamed not of Rome's glory or her husband's ambitions, but of Fulvia, the wine servant with the soft voice and quicker wit who could make her laugh even in the coldest moments. Their moments together were brief but burning, a shared smile across a crowded feast, fingertips brushing under the table as musicians played, an urgent meeting by the fig tree in the garden after everyone else had retired, where the heat of the summer night mingled with the heat of their stolen kisses. And though no records ever named them lovers, Gaius writes that history is often made not in stone but in silence. He closes the scroll and sets it gently beside the others, each one now bearing a red ribbon that trembles faintly in the evening air, and he looks out the window to see the torches of the night watch descending the Palatine, their voices echoing faintly off the arches as he remembers another tale, one even older, one told by a retired soldier who once guarded the Temple of Vesta. This soldier, Marcus, had little to his name, a limp from the wars in Dacia, a dented helmet, and a heart full of dusty stories. But when he spoke of the Vestal Virgins, his voice dropped lower, reverent, yet troubled, as if the mere memory of what he'd seen risked inviting divine punishment. He recalled the quiet beauty of the temple, the eternal flame flickering in the windless room, the cloaked figures moving like shadows along the sacred walls, and how once he caught sight of a young Vestal, Aelia, weeping silently by the fountain as she clutched a token hidden beneath her robes, a carved bone ring, worn smooth by years of secret touch. Aelia had fallen in love with a scholar from Alexandria, a man whose eyes saw her not as a holy symbol but as a human being, and though their meetings were rare and riddled with risk, they had shared scrolls and poems and glances in the library near the Forum, each encounter swelling with both joy and fear, until the day they were discovered by a priest who recognized the sin not in the love but in its challenge to order. The punishment, Marcus said, came swiftly and without mercy. Aelia was buried alive within the Campus Celeratus, her cries unheard beneath the weight of piety and silence, and the scholar was sent into exile, his name struck from the records. But Marcus remembered their story because love, even when punished, leaves footprints where it once walked. Gaius writes this all down, his hands steady but his eyes heavy with sleep. The candle nearly burned down to its base, and he finds himself thinking not just of the lovers, but of the watchers, the slaves who bore messages, the eunuchs who guarded secrets, the bath attendants who overheard confessions, the perfume girls who saw more than they ever said. And he decides that their stories to deserve parchment, There was Ariston, a Greek slave in the home of a retired magistrate, who had been trained in both rhetoric and massage, whose hands told stories far more honest than any court record, and who once served as the silent companion to a widow, who never remarried but who visited Ariston every evening after her bath, requesting not pleasure but poetry, recited slowly as the stars emerged over the Tiber. She was called Livia, and she paid Ariston in both coin and kindness, letting him read from her late husband's scrolls, trusting him with the scent of her skin and the burden of her grief. And though nothing ever passed between them that would be called scandalous, there grew between them a kind of love that didn't require the approval of law or God, just the comfort of shared space and sacred silence. Gaius writes their story gently, not with drama but with warmth, and he stacks the scroll atop the others as dawn begins to press softly against the edges of the sky, the sounds of the city, waking up with clattering pots, opening stalls, and the scent of bread baking in the alley below. He stands and stretches, his joints cracking softly like old floorboards, and he steps outside just as a woman with braided hair passes by, carrying a bundle of herbs, and she nods at him with familiarity, for she too has shared a story about her grandmother, once a courtesan beloved by a senator, who left behind a diary full of drawings and verses written in crude Latin and delicate Greek. The shop is quiet again, but inside Gaius knows that the shelves now hum with life, each scroll a small rebellion, each name written a resurrection, and he returns to his desk with fresh parchment, ready to write the next tale. One whispered to him by a young man who recently came from Hispania, who swears his mother was a priestess of Venus, and that he was conceived in a temple beneath a sky of stars and incense. And so, the ink flows again, slow and steady like the Tiber at night, and Gaius continues to write, not for fame, not for coin, but for the simple reason that stories, once forgotten, die, and in this city of marble and myth, every secret deserves to be heard at least once, especially those that dared to love where they were forbidden. The air in Gaius' shop was heavy with the scent of ink and old parchment as the oil lamp flickered low, casting soft golden shadows across the rows of scrolls and clay tablets piled haphazardly around the table. And as the bustling noise of the Via Sacra faded into the quiet hum of Roman dusk, Gaius dipped his reed pen into the thick black ink once more, leaned closer to his wax tablet, and began to carve the next chapter of what he had promised would be the most scandalously honest, deeply human, and utterly forgotten history of Roman pleasure, politics and private lives, a task he now felt was not only a form of personal redemption, but a final act of rebellion against the dry, sterilized versions of history written by men who had never dared look beneath the bedsheets of empire. He wrote of the Vestal Virgin Cornelia, who, though bound by sacred oaths to chastity and flame, had met in secret with a Macedonian sculptor who carved gods, but touched her like a mortal. The story preserved only in the cracked fragments of a statue where her face bore not the mask of religious duty, but the unmistakable blush of womanhood touched in the dark. And as Gaius carefully traced the tale onto his parchment, he remembered the priest's outrage and the silent whispers that followed when the sculptor vanished. Mysteriously, some said into the mines, others said into the catacombs where forbidden lovers carved hearts into stone walls. Gaius then wrote of the secret feasts of the Subura, the district where Roman order loosened like a drunk man's toga, where wealthy matrons disguised as courtesans descended under moonlight into taverns, whose walls sweated with wine vapors and laughter, where slaves and senators shared skins of Falernian wine and forgot the strictures of class and coin, and where one evening a boy no older than 15 recited Ovid's verses while blindfolded and kissed the ankles of every woman in the room until one in a silken red scarf pulled him close and whispered, "I'll teach you more than poetry." He paused only briefly, the candlelight flickering against his brow as memories long buried beneath duty began rising, like Pompey's ashes stirring in his blood, and he pressed on, writing now of the Brotherhood of the Laurel, a secret society, not of warriors but of philosophers and freedmen, who met each Saturnalia to abandon all laws of Rome and celebrate love in every form it appeared, man and man, woman and woman, elder and youth, slave and free, arguing not whether it was natural, but whether it was divine, and how many gods could be named to bless the shape of a body that burned for another. The scroll beneath his hands now read of Livia Minutia, an empress's cousin who collected lovers like a merchant. Collected spices not for lust, but for the stories they told while tangled in her sheets. Egyptian archers with lotus tattoos, Gaulish blacksmiths with calloused hands, a Jewish scribe who recited proverbs between kisses, and it was said that each morning she awoke and wrote their names in a secret book that had been hidden in her tomb, which Gaius himself had once seen unearthed during a festival where tomb robbers mistook the book for spells, not knowing they held in their hands a map of Rome's forbidden heartbeat. Outside, the sky shifted into a deep velvet hue, as night took over the 7 hills. And still Gaius wrote, unblinking, driven by memory and mission, writing of the twins of Aventine, boys born to a wine seller's daughter who grew up inseparable. So much so that they were whispered about in street gossip as lovers, not siblings. And though the rumors scorched their lives, one joined the army and the other the Senate, and when they reunited during a grain riot and found themselves on opposite sides, it was said, they both dropped their weapons and embraced in the middle of the mob, sparking silence in the crowd so complete that even Jupiter would have paused his thunder. He moved now to the bathhouses of Baiae, the sin-soaked coastal resort where Roman elites fled for pleasure masked as rest, where senators bathed not only to cleanse the body but to tempt fate, entering steam chambers where every man was equal in the eyes of the mist, where slaves offered massages that turned into dances, and where a whisper in the right ear could bring a Sicilian singer, a Greek acrobat, or a Nubian dancer to your private chamber before the next steam bell tolled. And Gaius recalled with aching clarity the time he had gone there, not as a scribe, but as a guest, and how he had felt the shame melt from his skin like sweat from his pores. Gaius' hand trembled slightly as he wrote of the temple of Bonadi, whose rituals were barred to men, yet whose stories haunted every curious Roman boy with images of wild rites. Flickering torches and mysteries whispered from mother to daughter he'd once spoken to an old midwife who claimed she had attended the aftermath of those ceremonies, delivering children whose fathers were never named, only smiled about behind closed doors, and she had called it the goddess's gift to the lonely, which Gaius had written down once and then hidden, afraid of what censors might do if they ever found it. His eyes burned now, but his heart surged as he remembered Marcus the eunuch, a performer in the forum who sang with a voice so haunting that even the crows on the rooftops quieted to listen, and who had once been summoned to the home of a magistrate's wife who believed his songs could mend her childless heart. But what unfolded instead was a story of mutual healing in the moonlight, one without touch, only shared sorrow, lullabies, and the trembling of fingers that never met but never needed to. The stories poured from Gaius now like water from a ruptured aqueduct, and he wrote of the Theatre of Shadows, a nighttime puppet show in the Field of Mars where masked performers enacted scenes of erotic myths, behind silk screens lit by firelight, drawing nobles and slaves alike into collective gasps and hidden arousals, where once a young Roman girl had fainted during the tale of Achilles and Patroclus, claiming she had seen their shadows kiss, and later became a poetess who wrote only by moonlight and only in ink made from mulberry and crushed rose petals. He chronicled the letters of Lentulus, a senator who wrote anonymous love letters to a gladiator, slipping them between bread loaves carried by kitchen boys. And when the gladiator was killed in the arena, the letters were discovered in his armor, every single one folded tightly and worn soft at the creases, smelling faintly of honey and laurel oil, and some said the senator wept openly before the Senate floor that day, claiming the gods had punished him not for the love, but for keeping it hidden like a sin. And as his ink dried on the parchment, Gaius exhaled deeply, leaning back to let his stiff shoulders rest. Yet even in the stillness of the lamplit room, he could feel that this was only the beginning, that these stories, these stolen-sized, silenced moans and forgotten names were more than scandal or memory. They were the flesh of Rome itself, soft and bruised, flawed and glowing, and he knew he would keep writing until his final breath or the final page, whichever came first, because someone had to remember that beneath the stone, the empire had pulsed with a human, holy heat. And so, without sleeping, without eating, with only the low hum of the night insects outside, and the glow of fireflies blinking against the walls of the alley. Gaius dipped his pen once more and began writing the next tale. This one about a certain tavern girl named Felicia from Trastevere, who had once claimed she could predict a man's future by the way he touched her clubbin, and the story, like the night, was only just beginning to unravel. And as the golden afternoon light drifted lazily across the narrow streets of the Subura, where laundry flapped from rope lines and sandals clattered rhythmically against cobbled stone, Gaius found himself back in the taberna where Livia, the widow with the ink-stained fingers, had once read aloud a scandalous poem by Ovid to a room full of merchants pretending not to listen, and he now sat again at that same worn wooden table surrounded by scrolls that rustled like dry leaves, listening to her whisper stories she swore were once whispered in the chambers of emperors and the shadows of temples. There was a hush that fell over the room as she began describing a practice that had become strangely fashionable among certain Roman elites, a kind of borrowed Egyptian ritual in which couples desperate to conceive would lie together beneath a carved ivory statue of Isis while a priest chanted sacred verses in a foreign tongue, and they believed that fertility flowed from the goddess's gaze directly into their bodies, even though no one truly understood what the words meant. She told of a senator's daughter who had once pretended to be a Vestal virgin for a night, not for religion but for the thrill of the forbidden, donning white robes and walking barefoot into the gardens behind her father's villa where she met her lover under the moonlight, the two of them reenacting a sacred ritual that, had they been caught, would have seen them buried alive without trial, and yet she claimed it was the most alive she had ever felt. And Gaius listened, eyes wide, heart strangely heavy, as Livia described how in some private corners of the empire, men and women paid to attend secret banquets, where the food was not consumed with mouths but with bodies, where honey was poured over backs and thighs and tongues, where the act of eating became a prelude to pleasure, and where the line between hunger and desire blurred, until no one could tell if they were starving for food or for flesh. She spoke of a boy from Gaul who came to Rome to study rhetoric, but was instead swept into the household of a retired general, who took him as a cupbearer and over time as a lover, not hidden, not whispered, but accepted among the household, slaves and visiting guests, because in private Rome was never quite what it claimed to be in public, and everyone had their own theater to perform behind closed doors. Then came the tale of the mosaic artist who fell in love with a gladiator and carved their passion into the very floor of a noble's summer estate, hiding their faces in geometric designs and winding vines. But if you knew where to look, Livia said, you could see the unmistakable curve of lips meeting and the bold outline of strong arms encircling slender hips, and this love frozen in stone would long outlive them both. And she told of older Roman women matronae who, tired of dull marriages, sought the company of traveling musicians and philosophers, offering them gold, not for their wisdom, but for their youth, their music and their silence afterward, and how this quiet economy of pleasure pulsed beneath the city like an unseen current, nourishing those who knew how to tap into its flow. One parchment she unrolled described a peculiar tradition during Saturnalia when slaves and masters would switch roles, and in one household a young male slave was dressed as the dominus, commanding his own master to serve him wine and massage his feet. And though it was meant as a joke, the evening ended with a tenderness neither of them expected. Tangled sheets and shared secrets before the world reset the next morning. Gaius, still writing, still listening, barely noticed how night had replaced day, how torches had been lit in the corners of the shop and flickered like distant stars. And as Livia lit a small clay lamp beside her, she drew forth her final scroll for the night, a worn piece of vellum that smelled of rosemary and waxent, recited a poem said to have been penned by a woman named Rufina who lived in Pompeii before the Ash, a poem so beautiful and raw that Gaius felt his hand tremble as he tried to copy the words. The poem spoke of two lovers meeting in a granary, hiding behind sacks of barley, an amphory of olive oil, whispering promises neither believed but both needed to hear, and how the dust clung to their skin like memory, how the smell of grain and sweat and citrus oil stayed with her for years after the man disappeared in the fires of Vesuvius. When she finished, the silence between them was not empty but sacred, like the pause before a prayer, and Livia touched Gaius's hand softly and said, There is no history without hunger, and no hunger without history. And in that moment he understood that the past was not only scrolls and statues, but also kisses and glances, and the way someone once touched someone else in the dark. And the next morning Gaius packed his satchel, tucked his notes carefully between layers of linen, and made his way toward the baths of Titus, where he had heard from a tavern keeper that the walls bore graffiti unlike any other carvings and inked verses left not by vandals but by poets, soldiers and lovers, who had all passed through its steam-filled halls. There, beneath the vaulted ceilings and dripping marble, Gaius traced his fingers along one inscription that read, "I touched her here, and she smiled like Venus reborn," and beside it, another, more faded, that read, "He made me forget my own name for an hour, and I was glad." And as the bath's steam rose and cloaked the air like a dream, Gaius realized that the stories he had gathered were not merely curiosities or guilty pleasures, but the heartbeat of Rome itself, hidden in the sweat of laborers, in the perfume of courtesans, in the whispers of slaves, in the ink-stained hands of widows, in the warmth of stolen moments, and that, perhaps, the only way to truly understand his city was not to read about its emperors, but to feel its pulse where its people once touched, laughed, and loved. The rains had passed and the dampness had lifted from the cobblestones of the Via Sacra as Gaius stepped out of his small shop with a fresh wax tablet under his arm, determined to continue recording the tales that had stirred deep from the scrolls of memory and whispered in his ears like the soft breath of history itself. And as he inhaled, the morning air mingled with olive oil, figs, and the distant incense of a nearby temple. He felt strangely both rooted and weightless, like a man tethered to time, yet slowly ascending through it. The shop door clicked shut behind him, and he walked through the early bustle where bakers unlatched shutters and vendors adjusted figs on platters with reverence as if each fruit held a secret, and he passed them with only a nod, already hearing in his mind the next story forming like clay in the hands of a sculptor, drawn from a memory not his own but as vivid as if he had lived it, this one belonging to a freedwoman named Lalia, who had once served a wealthy widow deep in the Aventine. Lalia had not always belonged to Rome. She had been taken from the coast of Illyria as a girl, sold into a wealthy Roman household where she learned quickly the secrets of both silence and observation. And it was in this house where the widow Lentella held private salons for senators, artists, and foreign mystics that Lalia learned the quiet code of gestures, the dance of veils, the language of fans and glances that spoke of desires so delicate and dangerous they could not be uttered aloud. As she poured wine or fanned the air during hot afternoons when Roman men reclined on couches, whispering of conquest or commerce, she noticed how often conversations circled not around war or grain but the private matters of the flesh, and how Lentula, still radiant in her late years, curated these gatherings less as social events and more as carefully designed performances of erotic power, with dancers from Egypt and lute players from Syria, brought in not just for music but to spark the edge of longing in the minds of her guests. Lalia told Gaius that in that household, sex was not just a bodily act, it was a currency, an influence, a performance, a negotiation, and, though Lentola never called it such, her entire home was a school of sensual rhetoric, where the tilt of a head or the removal of a sandal became as articulate as a senator's speech. One evening, during the feast of Vinalia, Lentula allowed Lalia to remain in the room, hidden behind a curtain, as a pair of lovers, an aristocratic matron and a young flute player, and at a private rite that was part devotion, part confession, and part release. And Lalia, barely breathing, had watched a woman guide the boy's hands with the patience of someone unlocking her own wounds, teaching him not how to give pleasure but how to listen with his entire body. From that night on, Lalia began to understand that in Roman life, particularly among the elite, sex was used not merely for pleasure or reproduction, but as a form of expression, healing, even transformation, and that the boundaries between dominance and surrender, power and vulnerability, were constantly negotiated in ways more complex than any law scroll could record. As Gaius walked past the Temple of Mercury, he scribbled in his wax tablet a line Lalia had once said with tears in her eyes. "I learned that the richest women in Rome were not those with coin, but those who could make a man kneel without lifting a hand," and with that he turned toward the Subura, where another voice had once shared her story in whispers and shadows. This was the tale of a man named Tyro, a scribe who worked in the court archives by day, but by night transformed into a performer in an underground theater where men and women wore masks shaped like satyrs, goddesses, beasts, and emperors, and enacted scenes of mythic lust, shame, ecstasy, and defiance, blurring the line between actor and self until the mask no longer concealed but revealed. Tyro told Gaius that the theater beneath the Subura was called Domus Imaginum, the House of Imagination. It was not merely for debauchery but for something deeper, a ritual of release where people from all ranks came to shed the skin that Rome forced them to wear each day and let their truest, most secret selves rise like steam from a bath. He remembered one performance where a Vestal Virgin and a gladiator reenacted the myth of Mars and Rhea Silvia, with the roles reversed, the Virgin wielding the sword and the fighter weeping beneath her, and how the audience gasped not in shame but recognition, for it spoke to their buried knowledge that power and desire were always flickering flames never fixed, always dancing. Gaius paused by a small fountain and traced the image of a satyr etched into the stone, thinking of how Tyro had said, "In that house, men learned to be soft and women learned to be fierce, and for once Rome did not punish them for it." And he wondered if the soul of a city could be found in such hidden places rather than in marble halls and golden laurel wreaths. Then came the story of Faustus, a baker's son from the Aventine, who as a youth had secretly fallen in love with his best friend Lucius, the son of a retired centurion, and how they would meet beneath the aqueduct arches to read poetry to each other, hands sometimes brushing, voices sometimes breaking, until one night in a storm they kissed, and it was as if the entire city had become still and listening. But Lucius was soon betrothed to a senator's daughter, and Faustus, heartbroken yet understanding the code of survival, never spoke of the kiss again, but he remembered how that single act changed how he moved in the world, how he saw men and women differently, how he understood that love in Rome was often a matter of translation, of unspoken lines and hidden meanings that had to be carved carefully into action and expression. Faustus never married, but opened his own bakery and became known for making honeyed cakes in the shape of dolphins and hearts. And Gaius had once tasted one and felt a wave of sweetness and sorrow all at once, as if the man had baked longing into flour, sugar, and fire. The day stretched into late noon as Gaius moved toward the Trastevere district, where he met a man named Crispus, once a soldier who had fought in Britannia and returned not with gold or glory, but with a memory he could never erase of a woman he had met among the Iceni, who had shown him what it meant to be touched not as a conqueror, but as a man. Her name was Alona, and she had taught him that pleasure could be a gift, not a weapon, and that to be vulnerable was not to be weak but to be seen, fully, terrifyingly, and beautifully. And Crispus wept as he told Gaius that he had never found such love in Rome, because in Rome, men were taught to dominate, to hide softness, to fear surrender. Gaius wrote furiously as the words poured from Crispus like wine from a cracked amphora, and when he finished, the former soldier kissed his own scarred knuckles and whispered, "She told me my body was not a tool of war but of connection," and it echoed in Gaius's mind like a bell for hours after. As night approached, the city turned golden and violet, and Gaius returned to his shop, lighting a single oil lamp, placing the new tablets next to the older ones, and realizing with a shiver that these stories, each so intimate, so vulnerable, so alive, were slowly forming a new map of Rome, one not marked by conquests or temples, but by whispers, touches, glances, secrets, and longing. He thought of all the names: Lalia, Tyro, Faustus, Crispus, and others not yet recorded, and how their stories formed a tapestry. Behind the official history, an undercurrent of Rome's soul, written not in laws or battles, but in the soft places where bodies met, where masks were removed, where the unspoken became sacred. As the oil flickered and the shadows lengthened, Gaius picked up his stylus one last time and wrote a line at the bottom of the newest tablet. In the spaces where the empire turned its gaze away, Rome remembered how to feel, and with that, he extinguished the lamp, the city humming softly outside his window, and fell into a dream where every statue had a heartbeat, and every wall whispered the truths no senator dared to speak aloud. The candlelight in Gaius's shop flickered faintly as he unrolled the anonymous scroll with cautious fingers, the title alone already suggesting secrets too dangerous for even the shadows of Rome to whisper aloud. And as his eyes met the first elegantly inked line, it felt as if the very marble walls of his city had hushed to listen. It began with the story of a senator's wife named Tertia married off at 16 into a house of powerful men whose reputations were matched only by the severity of their silence regarding anything unclean, yet whose private rituals painted a vastly different image than the statues standing proud in the forum. Tertia had grown up among the Vestals, not as one of them, but as a ward of a high priestess whose envy denied her the white veil, leaving her instead with knowledge unfit for matrimony, and on her wedding night, this knowledge became a blade both curse and weapon as her husband, Lucius, older by 20 years, demanded submission with ceremonial chants, learned from Etruscan manuals, not affection. But her obedience, as the scroll described in maddening detail, wasn't blind, it was strategic, for she endured Lucius's elaborate role-play of being Jupiter incarnate and herself Juno, clothed in gold-threaded robes, until she mastered his rhythm like a song, turning his divine fantasies into rehearsed scripts she could manipulate like a playwright. The scroll described an astonishing moment during the annual Saturnalia, when inversion of power was not only allowed but expected. Tertia turned her private quarters into a stage of reversal, commanding Lucius to become her servant in bed, convincing him that Jupiter himself enjoyed role reversals as part of cosmic balance, and the power she felt with each whispered command was like tasting thunder on her tongue. Soon, other noble wives began visiting her under the guise of poetry readings, yet inside those marble halls, they learned to speak through touches, to express desire through perfumed fingers, to reclaim what Rome had taught them, to fear agency within ecstasy, mystery without shame. One passage burned itself into Gaius's mind: how a certain patrician woman had embroidered coded symbols into her bedsheets, each curve and stitch marking a mood, an invitation, a rejection, or a challenge, allowing her to maintain dignity while orchestrating nightly dramas that could rival the tragedies performed in the theater of Pompey. As Gaius turned the page, he realized the scroll didn't just recount tales, it revealed a system of silent language. Among Rome's elite women, a network of power wielded not in the Senate but in whispers passed from silk pillows to bathhouse, murmurs their intimacy encrypted like political dispatches. There was the tale of Livia Severina, widow of a tribune, who, instead of mourning in black, dressed herself in Tyrian purple and hosted salons where young gladiators were invited, not for their strength but their subtlety, and where each candle lit was a signal of what kind of night her guests could expect. No words ever spoken, allowed only glances and shared grapes. Then came the most cryptic part of the scroller diagram, inked carefully but with slight trembling lines, showing an underground chamber below the Temple of Bonadi, marked only by 3 serpent symbols and a crescent moon, followed by a warning that read, "Only the initiated enter with their senses intact." Gaius's heart pounded, not just from the implication that sacred spaces were being used for profane purposes, but from the realization that everything he thought he knew of Rome as sexual morality was merely theater, a layer of marble hiding a mosaic far more chaotic and colorful beneath. He leaned back in his chair, the candle nearly down to its last breath, imagining Tertia, Livia, and the other unnamed heroines, not as victims or deviants, but as secret authors of a shadow society within Rome, one that wrote its history, not on papyrus, but on flesh, fragrance, and forbidden memory. For a moment, the scent of crushed myrrh seemed to rise from the scroll itself, and Gaius felt as if he could hear soft footsteps echoing behind him, as if the very women of these tales had stepped out from ink to air, watching him, judging whether he was worthy of knowing more. Outside, the moon dipped behind a slow-moving cloud, casting the street in a sudden silver blindness, and Gaius, compelled by something between dread and devotion, gathered his robes and left the shop, clutching the scroll tightly as he walked toward the hills above the Tiber, where a certain 3-serpent carving had once caught his eye near a neglected shrine. Each step he took was met by memory of previous stories, of whispers in alleyways, of the old woman's tale from the countryside, and now of this secret order among noble wives, and the city that once felt so solid underfoot now seemed to float, like the Rome of dreams, shifting with every secret unveiled. He reached the edge of the shrine just as the stars cleared, and he saw it again, the three serpents, faded but present, and below them a stone that seemed to pulse in the moonlight like a heartbeat, as if waiting to be moved, as if guarding an entrance never meant for men. As he touched the stone, the scroll in his hand began to warm slightly, and in that instant he understood these stories weren't meant for record-keeping. They were invitations, tests, perhaps even initiations themselves, and by reading them, by seeking out their locations, he had crossed a threshold no ink could erase. A soft click echoed as the stone shifted under his fingers, revealing a narrow stairway spiraling downward, and the scent of old incense wafted up, mingling with something more human, more intimate, the breath of secrets too old to be spoken above ground. Gaius descended slowly, and with each step, a new scene played in his imagination, of silk against skin, of laughter behind veils, of ancient chants twisting into moans, until he reached a chamber where the walls themselves were carved with stories, and the floor was a map made of polished bones and crushed rose petals. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and upon it rested a bronze mirror, cracked in a single line across the surface, and when he looked into it, Gaius saw not his reflection, but an unfamiliar room, filled with women seated in a circle, their faces calm, their eyes fixed on him, as if awaiting his decision. And so, as Gaius sat alone in the fading light of his lantern-lit taberna, where his quill scraped gently against the worn parchment, and the rustling of the streets outside turned into a distant hum, he found his thoughts drifting again into a story long buried beneath the marble pride of Rome, a tale of noble betrayal, unspoken passion, and the cost of defying the sexual decorum demanded by honor and legacy in the rigid patrician circles of the Eternal City. It was during the reign of Emperor Claudius, when paranoia bloomed in the palaces like mold in forgotten basements, that Lucilla, a daughter of the ancient house of Aemilius, found herself promised to a senator whose breath reeked of old wine and whose hands trembled more from guilt than age. And though her betrothal was painted with the golden brush of alliance and power, her heart was already entangled in secret with her slave tutor, a clever Syrian named Necho, who whispered poetry to her behind silk drapes and taught her more than Latin conjugations beneath the painted ceiling of the garden portico. By day, Lucilla donned her mask of silent obedience, eyes lowered as she listened to the senators toast her future with goblets of spiced wine and murmur of bloodlines and dowries. But by night, she shed her tunic like a lie and crept barefoot into the hidden room beneath her villa, where Nevo waited with trembling fingers and verses from Sappho carved into his memory, and their love unfolded not in fire, but in quiet defiance, like lilies blooming through cracks in concrete. Their love-making was unlike the Roman expectation, for it was not a performance of dominance and surrender, but a communion, a sacred choreography where power melted into vulnerability. And even though Nevo bore the legal label of property, in those moments, he ruled her soul more completely than any senator could command her body. But Rome had ears, and love leaves footprints, even in silence. So it was not long before whispers reached the ears of Lucilla's father, a man too proud to be shamed and too ruthless to forgive. And he summoned his daughter not with a shout, but a scroll sealed with the signet of doom, inviting her to a private dinner, where the main course was truth served cold with a side of humiliation. Lucilla arrived draped in dignity, not sorrow, and when her father confronted her with the rumors, she did not tremble nor plead, but spoke of love as something divine, stronger than law, older than the Senate, and her father's eyes, bloodshot and furious, could not comprehend how his daughter could trade marble for clay, lineage for lust, and in his rage, he ordered Nevo to be taken, not executed, no, but worse, sold to a brothel near the Suburra, where the elite sent their enemies not to die, but to disappear beneath layers of anonymous skin and sweat. Nevo's screams were silent as he was dragged through the marble halls he once walked as a teacher, and Lucilla, chained by her womanhood and status, could do nothing but collapse into the arms of her nurse, her soul howling even as her face remained a mask of Roman discipline. Years passed, And Lucilla married the senator, bore him children, and sat dutifully beside him at banquets. Her smile always slightly too stiff, her gaze always lingering a moment too long on the slave musicians. And though she never spoke of Nevo again, every poem she copied into her private scrolls bore a footnote in Aramaic, a code known only to two hearts. And Gaius, who read the story from a crumbling stack of hidden scrolls preserved in the estate of a librarian who once served the Emily, felt the weight of Lucilla's ghost leaning over his shoulder, whispering not sorrow but the ache of unresolved endings, and in that ache he found the pulse of Rome's hidden truths, for even behind the facade of triumphal arches and Senate decrees, it was always these fragile, forbidden loves that shaped the true contours of its history. The candle in Gaius's taberna sputtered, casting long shadows on the walls filled with scrolls and memories, and as he dipped his quill once more, he found his hand pulling him toward the story of Titus Claudian, a gladiator famed not just for his unmatched skill in the arena, but for the scandal that rocked the empire, when it was discovered that he belonged not to a lanista but to a Vestal virgin. The Vestals, keepers of Rome's sacred fire, were meant to be untouchable living emblems of chastity and discipline, and yet beneath her white veil Vestal Marciana had eyes that burned with longing and a spirit choked by years of imposed silence, until the day she watched Titus fight beneath the harsh sun and saw not a warrior, but a man who moved like a god and bled like a martyr. Their affair began with glances exchanged between prayer and punishment, then notes hidden beneath offerings in the temple, and finally secret meetings in the catacombs where incense and sweat mingled into something holy. And when they made love, it was not merely a defilement of oaths, but a reclaiming of humanity stolen by institutions that worshipped control more than divinity. Rome did not tolerate cracks in its divine image, so when the affair was exposed by a jealous priest who had lusted in silence for Marciana for years, the punishment came swift and brutal. Titus was to be executed in the arena by wild beasts, and Marciana was sentenced to the ancient ritual of live burial, sealed within a stone chamber beneath the earth with a single loaf of bread and a lamp, a symbolic mercy that only prolonged death. But as the day of execution arrived, a riot broke out in the Colosseum, for the people had grown to love Titus, whose every victory felt like a challenge to the aristocracy, and led by fellow gladiators and a mob of commoners, they stormed the holding cells and freed him, and under moonlight he fled the city with Marciana hidden beneath a merchant's cloak, disappearing into the wilds of Dacia, where some say they lived as shepherds, their past buried deeper than the empire dared to dig. Gaius paused, hand shaking slightly as he finished the final line of the story, knowing that truth often lay not in records but in rumors, and even if the tale of Titus and Marciana was embroidered with fantasy, it captured a deeper, aching reality, that love in Rome was often a rebellion, and pleasure, when honest, could topple towers more effectively than swords. Outside, the rain began to fall, soft and steady, as if the heavens themselves mourned the stories lost to censorship and time, and Gaius leaned back, staring at the ceiling where shadows of scrolls danced like specters. And he remembered the strange manuscript given to him by a traveling Egyptian merchant, a record supposedly transcribed from the diary of a eunuch priest of Cybele, who served not only the goddess but also the secret sexual needs of Rome as most powerful women. With trembling anticipation, Gaius unrolled the scroll, eyes scanning the first lines, which described an underground sanctuary where moaning echoed louder than prayers, where rites of fertility were performed not with sacrifice, but with elaborate role-play and intoxicating potions that loosened the grip of Roman rigidity, allowing noble women to dress as soldiers, slaves to pose as emperors, and gender to dissolve into sensation. The priest, named Nemetheus, wrote of how he guided the ceremonies, sometimes donning the golden mask of the goddess herself, and how clients, senators, wives, widowed aristocrats, even empresses in disguise, would weep after climax, not out of shame but because in those brief moments they touched something real, something lost in their marble cages, something no statue or shrine could provide. His descriptions were vivid yet compassionate, portraying not lust but healing, not perversion but liberation, and Gaius felt a strange warmth in his chest as he read, for in those secret rites he saw a mirror to his own mission, to uncover Rome not as it wanted to be seen, but as it truly was, flawed, yearning, deeply human. The scroll ended with a warning, a final line scrawled hastily in darker ink. "They came for me at dawn," it read, "with fire and chains. Not because I sinned, but because I reminded them they were not gods." Gaius set the scroll down, heart pounding, and stared out into the wet streets of the Subura, where shadows moved beneath flickering torches and lovers clung to each other in doorways. And in the heartbeat of the city he heard the echoes of every untold story, every buried kiss, every pleasure punished by pride. And as the rain turned to mist, and mist to silence, Gaius dipped his quill again, eyes heavy but spirit alight, and began to write of the next tale, one whispered to him by an old sailor, who claimed to have once loved a man who wore armor by day and silk by night, and whose final words before dying in Germania were not of glory, but of a poem written in the hand of a poet who waited for him in Ostia, as dawn returned to the Roman sky like a pale sheet being gently unfurled above the city's time-worn rooftops. Gaius sat with ink-stained fingers and a mind heavy with memories. He could no longer keep silent, and while the scrolls around him began to multiply like creeping ivy across the stone desk, each one marked with fragments of Rome's whispered intimacies and unspoken customs, there was one scroll in particular he reached for now. The one that chronicled not the elite villas nor the perfumed whispers of courtesans, but the quiet, overlooked lives of Rome's common folk whose stories too were tethered to desire, ritual restraint and rebellion in a city that had made even its pleasures part of the state's fabric. In the crowded insulae apartments of Subura, where families huddled shoulder to shoulder in narrow rooms and where thin curtains often served as the only barrier between public life and private yearning, Gaius recalled how intimacy was negotiated like borrowed coin, quietly, quickly, and often without the luxury of secrecy, for these were people whose hours were consumed not by lounging in baths or dictating letters, but by grinding flour, hauling water, stitching garments, and chasing bread for the morrow. And yet, even among them, the rhythms of lust and affection thrummed like the distant drums of Bacchic festivals, always present, always pulsing just beneath the grime. He wrote of a washerwoman named Livia, whose arms were strong from slapping linens against stone, whose fingers were red from lye, and who would come home each night to her one-room flat above a tavern smelling of wine and sweat, where her husband Marcus, a cart driver, would await her with calloused palms and a hunger that was more about closeness than conquest. And Gaius remembered how she once told him, in the market laughing behind a basket of figs, that their lovemaking was often interrupted by the stomping of drunks below or the creaking of the neighbor's bedpost above, but that their passion felt real because it was hard-won, stolen between the demands of the world, rough around the edges like the clay cups they drank from, and all the more precious because of it. In describing Livia, Gaius turned the scroll slightly, ink gliding with unusual care, for he wanted to capture how even without silk robes or exotic oils, the act of love was not diminished, but rather transformed, made holy even by necessity and resilience. And how Livia once whispered that the only perfume she ever wore was the oil left from the olive she pressed with her bare hands. And Marcus had once told her it smelled better than myrrh, and whether or not he meant it didn't matter, because in the dim candlelight of a humble Roman apartment, that was all the poetry they needed. And then Gaius turned his thoughts to the bathhouse attendants, men and women alike, who spent their days amid steam and sweat, who saw every kind of body, plump, scarred, adolescent, elderly bodies that carried stories, secrets, and shame. And it was these attendants who understood more about Rome's sensuality than any senator or poet ever could, because they saw where beauty faded and touch lingered. They saw where backs arched involuntarily, where gazers lingered a moment too long between steaming pools. And though they never spoke of it aloud, Gaius had learned from one former balneatrix, a woman named Rufa, that the bathhouse was not just a place of cleansing, but of coded glances and veiled invitations where someone brushing a shoulder beneath the hot water could mean more than entire speeches in the forum. He recalled Rufa telling him one night, when she came to the Via Sacra shop to buy a love charm, how sometimes after the final patrons had left and only echoes remained beneath the domed ceiling, She would lower herself into the lukewarm water and imagine what it must be like to be caressed for her own sake, not merely observed or brushed past. And in her quiet confession, Gaius sensed the aching loneliness that underpinned even the most open society, where the body was displayed but the soul remained shuttered behind ritual and law. And he wrote her words carefully because he knew that Rome's sensuality was not just about acts, it was about longing, about all the touches that never happened. He continued the scroll with the dice makers, the grain measurers, and the beggars at the temple. Steps people whose erotic lives were rarely captured in marble, but burned just as brightly, if briefly, in whispered exchanges, behind market stalls or in the shadows of unfinished aqueducts. And he remembered a couple, Floris and Petronia, who had nothing but a shared blanket and a broken cart. Yet they made love each night beneath the stars behind the Flaminian Gate, and they claimed the open sky made them feel more honest, more free, as if the gods themselves turned away out of modesty. But Gaius could not ignore the darker corners either, the alleyways where hunger and violence blurred the lines between desire and desperation. And he wrote, with a trembling hand, about the brothel workers who had no name for intimacy beyond what coin could purchase. Yet even among them, Gaius had found moments of surprising agency, like the woman called Unia, who painted her eyes not for seduction, but for armor, who timed her breathing to the creak of the brothel bed, and who once whispered to Gaius, "They take my body, but not my story." And those 7 words rang louder in Gaius's mind than all the war speeches of Caesar. He paused, dipped his pen again, and returned to the scrolls with a renewed reverence, because he now saw Rome not just as a marble city of conquest, but as a tapestry of hidden pulses, each thread a heartbeat, a secret, a moan stifled behind a doorframe or released in a fit of laughter between lovers leaning against a crumbling wall. And he remembered how even the dying old man down the street had once said, "In the end, we remember only who touched us and how." And those words, scribbled hastily onto a torn scrap, had stayed with Gaius longer than any law of the 12 tables. The shop began to warm now with the rising sun, light creeping across the papyrus and dancing on the polished figurine of Venus that rested near the window. And Gaius, half mad with stories and sleepless nights, turned at last to his own reflection in the bronze mirror hanging crookedly above his writing desk. And he saw not a chronicler, but a conduit, not a historian, but a vessel through which Rome's forgotten could speak. And in that moment he understood that what he was capturing wasn't just history, it was humanity, naked and yearning, aching and eternal. And so he set down his pen only briefly to close his eyes, whisper a silent prayer to Mercury the messenger, and prepare himself to begin the next scroll. Gaius sat silently on the worn wooden bench outside his little shop on the Via Sacra, the first orange hints of dawn warming the sky above the rooftops, his ink-stained fingers resting gently over the last scroll he had filled during the long sleepless night, a scroll that now held the final forgotten tales of a Rome most would never know. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the cool morning breeze wash across his face, listening to the distant clip-clop of hooves and the soft rustling of early merchants preparing their stalls, his mind still caught in the echoes of stories told in whispers, laughter, moans, and prayers, all of them memories of passion and power, of bodies and beliefs, of pleasure and punishment. In the depths of his thoughts he saw once more the noble woman Marcia draped in silk, smiling through the incense smoke in her secret garden of delights, her laughter dancing through the hedges like bells on a summer wind, her lovers both scandalous and sacred. He remembered Livia, the courtesan turned philosopher whose sharp tongue and sharper mind made men kneel long before she ever undressed, her words carving deeper truths than the blades of the Senate guards, her scrolls of philosophy and passion buried beneath the temple of Minerva. He saw again the Vestal Alea's trembling hand as she dropped a sacred torch in her moment of shame and desire, her lips still wet with sin, her punishment unfolding beneath the silent stares of marble gods, a symbol of both purity betrayed and humanity reclaimed. He recalled the underground painted walls of the Suburra, where graffiti spoke of trysts and betrayals of slaves loving masters and gladiators, promising forever before the next day's bloodbath. Each carved line a desperate attempt to hold on to love before death made it meaningless. He saw again Lucius and Marcus, two senators hidden beneath masks in the masked Saturnalia, orgy touching one another as if no eyes watched, even though 100 did, daring in that brief moment to let their hands speak what their mouths could not utter in daylight. He heard the low hum of prayer from the priestesses of Isis, who claimed their bodies were not their own but lent to the goddess to channel the divine ecstasy of creation, who danced with slow sensuality beneath torchlight until their god took shape within them. He saw the twisted games of Emperor Domitian's palace, where fear and desire became indistinguishable, where pleasures were currency and the boundaries of decency existed only as lines waiting to be crossed for entertainment, control, or cruelty. He recalled the chamber of mirrors built by Caligula, where noble women were summoned not for love but for their resemblance to statues of Venus, forced to become reflections of divine desire in a room where no act was private and no boundary sacred. He thought of the eunuch boy Plotinus, who wrote poetry of longing and love that never found a body to rest within, whose soft voice and delicate soul had no place among Rome's roaring arenas, but whose quiet verses were still recited in whispered corners. He remembered the old woman who sold love potions near the Tiber Bridge, her hut reeking of herbs and sweat, her chants blending Latin with something older even than Rome itself, offering lust in exchange for coin, curses in exchange for tears. He smiled at the memory of the two bakers, both men, who shared a single room and two ovens, but enough love to make the whole neighborhood jealous, their fingers sticky with flour and affection, their lives ignored by law but blessed by every child they fed. He saw again the ghost of the girl from Pompeii who had scribbled crude love poems on the bathhouse wall before Vesuvius silenced her, and he wondered if her words had ever been read, or if ash had preserved the longing without ever satisfying it. He remembered the soldiers who visited the desert temples in Syria, paying coin to priestesses who whispered in strange tongues and held them in ways that Roman wives never could, their eyes glazed with longing for something softer than war. He thought of the funeral masks, so lifelike, so solemn, and yet behind each one there had once been a man or woman who loved, who desired, who reached for another body in the darkness of the Roman night, only to leave behind wax and mirth. And he thought of himself, Gaius, the recorder, the listener, the scribe, whose own name would fade from time but whose scribes might one day be found and puzzled over, their ink faded but still stubborn, still clinging to truth, still whispering Rome's most private secrets. The sun began to rise in earnest now, casting gold across the dusty cobblestones and turning even broken columns into pillars of fire. And Gaius stood slowly, his knees creaking, his eyes squinting at the blinding light of another day. He rolled the final scroll with trembling hands, tied it with a thin leather strap and placed it in the worn chest, beneath the statue of Mercury in his shop where all the others waited, a library of love, lost, lust and longing, hidden behind a wall of incense jars and bronze trinkets. Outside the world returned to its usual rhythm. Merchants arguing, children laughing, a mule stubbornly refusing to move, but inside that tiny shop, 1,000 years of secrets slumbered, waiting for a curious hand or a lonely night to bring them back to life. Gaius lit a final candle, not to see by, but to remember by, and as the flame danced, he whispered a prayer not to the gods of the capital, but to every man and woman whose story he had carried across the years. May your love not be forgotten, may your bodies be remembered, may your desires be forgiven. Then he sat once more, took a deep breath, and let the silence of Rome settle over him like a soft woolen cloak, warm, familiar, eternal. And so ends the tale of what sex was really like in ancient Rome, not as a list of positions or laws, not as a scandalous collection of salacious acts, but as a mosaic of hearts beating beneath togas and tunics, of hands trembling with desire, of whispered names lost to time, but never to meaning. They were human, as we are, full of longing, confusion, power, shame, rebellion, grace, and love, and their bodies told stories long after their voices fell silent. So if you ever walk the stones of the Roman Forum, or stare at the fading frescoes of a villa in Pompeii, listen closely. The walls still remember. And now, dear listener, if you've made it this far into the final chapter of this long, sleepy, ancient story. Thank you. We hope your eyes are heavier, your thoughts softer, and your dreams filled with marble streets and candlelight secrets. Please don't forget to subscribe to Boring Historian Sleepy for more sleepy historical stories like this. We post new immersive sleep narrations every week to help you rest, relax, and drift away into the forgotten corners of time. Like this video if it brought you peace or fascination. Leave a comment telling us your favorite moment from ancient Rome, and share this with someone who needs a calm escape tonight. Until our next sleepy adventure. Good night, traveler of time, and may your dreams be draped in velvet and lit by oil lamps from long ago.